We'll do a review of the Sichas in Chelek Yutes, volume 19, the first sicha for the Parsha Nitzavim. This is a Rashi sicha, and a little bit unusual in Rashi. Rashi brings down three interpretations, but he brings down the first interpretation right in the beginning of the pasuk, Atem Nitzavim, the first Rashi in the Parsha. He continues to explain the Parsha a little bit, a few psukim, and then he comes back and gives two more pirushim. And whenever Rashi gives an extra pirushim, so we need to know why is the first pirush not good enough, especially Rashi says umedrash agode, and then this third one, what's the second or third? That's always needs to be explained why that is. In addition to that, the Rebbe is going to address various different details in the Pasuk Pshat. So if you look in the Pasuk, in the beginning of Atem Nitzavim, so basically it says, Atem Nitzavim hayom kulcham lifnei Hashem Elokeichem. So Rashi comments, you are all standing today before God your God. So Rashi comments, Atem Nitzavim melamed, that this teaches us shekonsa Moshe lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'yom Moshe, that on the day of his passing, of Moshe Rabbeinu's passing, he gathered them before Hashem, and the purpose was lachnisam bibris, to bring him into the covenant. So the first issue that the Rebbe is going to deal with, because this says the pasuk beferish avrecha bibris Hashem Elokecha Wolosow. So we see to pass you through the covenant of God your God, and in his oath, Asher Hashem Elokecha kodesh simcha hayom, which God your God forms with you today. So what is this that Rashi is telling us over here? A chiddush that he gathered them together, lachnisam bivris, that Moshe gathered lachnisam bivris, as we'll see by Richos. Then, after the psukim over here, Rashi continues explaining in the pasuk Yud Beis, and after pasuk Yud Beis, Rashi says like this: Atkan pirashti lifi pshuta shel parsha. And then Rashi goes on and says, "Umedrash agode lama nismecha parsha atem nitzavim l'klolos." Why was the portion of Atem Nitzavim next to the clothes, which we learn in the portion of Kisovei? Over there, the Torah records all the clothes, the curses. So it says, "Lefisha shamu Yisrael meya klolos chaser shtayim," because they heard 100 curses minus 2. Chutz mimem tesher b'Torah's kahanim. That's besides the 49, which the Parshas B'chukoisai is the Torah's kahanim and the Vayikra. Their faces turned colors, and they said, who can stand by these kind of clothes? So Moshe began to appease them, and he says to them, Atem Nitzavim hayom, you're standing today, don't worry, you have gotten Hashem angry many times, he had not destroyed you, and you're standing before him. Atem Nitzavim hayom means you're standing. Then Rashi explains what is the meaning of the word hayom. Kayom hazeh, this hadeh means like the day. Shu kayom, the day exists. It's dark and then it shines. Lechem, shine for you as well. And in the future it will continue to shine for you. Vaklolos vayisurim, and these curses and the pains, they stand you, and they station you strong lefona before Hashem. Not only that, Rashi says, "Va'afa parsha lefona b'zeh." The previous parsha, the parshas of Kiseitze, the Kisove. So over there, also the pasuk says the whole parsha begins here. So Rashi says this is also all piyusim for the, that comes right after the Teichacha. The Teichacha precedes that. The parsha before that, all the Torah, then it comes Piyusim, and this is further with the Piyusim. Then Rashi comes with a third pshat. Atam Nitzavim, Yisrael Yotzim Meparnas Leparnas. Since the Yidden were going out from one leader to another leader, Moshe Rabbeinu was passing away and Yeshua was taking over. Moshe Yeshua. The Fikach also is a matzeva, so he made them a matzeva, means standing, kedei lezarzum, in order to encourage them. So this is sort of encouragement as they're leaving from one leader to the other. V'chein also Yeshua, v'chein Shmuel, v'chein Yeshua, Shmuel, Yisyatzu v'shavta eschem, k'sheyotzu miyodem nichzu yodah shel Shol, when they left Yeshua and they went to Shol. These are the three Rashis that the Rebbe is going to deal with. The Rebbe is not going to go into all the details of these Rashis. The Rebbe leaves that. But just I went through so we know what these Rashis say. So now let's go back into the sicha to Ois Aleph. So the Rebbe in Ois Aleph, if Atem Nitzavim Hayoim, Rashi quotes from the Pasuk Atem Nitzavim, you're standing today, because today the Rashi explains in the next Rashi. Rashi explains what is the meaning of Hayoim. No, Rashi doesn't say Hayyim. I thought Rashi says over here the Hayyim. But in any event, the Rashi's based himself on the words Atam Nitzavim. So the Rebbe brings down Hayyim in a parenthesis because it's Atam Nitzavim. So if Atam Nitzavim, stellt sich Rashi is Mefarish. So Rashi places himself and he explains. This teaches us that Moshe gathered them before Hashem on the day that he passed. To bring them into the bris. Is do nicht verstandig. So over here it's not understood. Was is do Rashi mechadish? What is Rashi coming and teaching us something new? That melamed shekinsum chulu lachnisum bebris. That this teaches us that he gathered them all to enter them into the covenant. This is referish. The pasuk says, "Atem nitzavim hayom gemer." A few psukim later, what was the purpose? Is that is to pass you through the covenant of Hashem Elokecha. So we knew that is lachnis bibris. Why does Rashi have to tell us that? So Mefarshim learning, some of the commentators learn that it's not the bris that the chiddush is that he brought the bris, but the chiddush is that Moshe Rabbeinu gathered them. It just says Atam Nitzavim. So where is the gathering for them? And he needed to gather them in order to bring them through La'avrecha b'bris. They needed to be there to go through the bris. So the first learning as the chiddush for Rashi Malamed Chulu is not in them lachnitzum b'bris. It's not that this is the novelty over here that he brought them into the covenant, or statement Meferish and Pasuk, which says. Specifically, clearly in the verse, not in them kinsa Moshe Chulu, but in the fact that Moshe gathered them. In Pasuk state nor Atem Nitzavim. The verse just says that you're standing. Kendoch Zayin. So it's possible. Maybe he did not gather them. They were standing where they are. As they were standing, gathered around the Oren. Zokt Rashi, therefore Rashi says, Malame, this teaches us, he had to gather them. He couldn't just have them to stay over there, since they have to go through the Bris Hashem Elokecha. You have to be there to go through the covenant. What's Rashi's evidence that he gathered them? Is from Lachnisam Bibris, since he's bringing them into the covenant. So that's why he knows he kinsa. That's what Rashi brings down, that he gathered them. Kinisa libris is dur chavora. How do you enter into the covenant? You must go through, as the pasuk says, la'avrucha b'bris Hashem Elokecha. You must go through. Kinisa dur chavora was there two muzayim for your kinus. How are you going to go through if you're not gathered for? So therefore, the Mefarshim learn that that's the chiddush in Rashi, that there was a gathering. As Rabbi Shver, I learned in the Pirush Rashi. This is, however, difficult to interpret this in Rashi. If this is what Rashi means, Aleph, hat Rashi gedarf mighty sein in dem Dibur HaMaschil. Rashi should have quoted in the opening words, euch divided die Keverte la'avrecha bevris. Also to quote the words la'avrecha bevris, atem nitzavim, and Rashi should have said goimer la'avrecha bevris, which says a few psukim later, because was from them is ein hechrech. How does Rashi know melamed shekinsum is because it says la'avrecha bevris? Rashi should have quoted that because that's his evidence. Base. Rashi uses the lashon shekinsum. Rashi should have said she'aviram. Erot gidav zogen nit lachnisom, not to lachnisom over here, lachnisom bebris, not lahaviram bebris. Nor derech lashon hakosuv should have used the lashon of the pasuk la'avrecha. He should have said lahaviram bebris. V'sterfun is the rayas kinsum. That's the evidence that he gathered them is because the pasuk says lahaviram. So we should say that lahaviram. So why does Rashi says laha lachnisom? Gimel. Klal from Lashon Rashi. Rebbe says if you read the Rashi, you see the chiddush is not in the kinsum. The chiddush is lahaviram bebris. From Lashon Rashi, melamed shekinsum Moshe chul lachnisom bebris. He gathered them to bring them into the covenant. Is mashma, it appears. The chiddush for Rashi b'shteit in lachnisim bebris. That Rashi's novelty is that he's bringing them to the covenant. Nit in the etzem inyan v'skinsum. It's not that he gathered them. Lachnisim bebris ozayim blois derayim of them. And we're saying that how do we know that he gathered them? Because he brought them into the bris, and they had to be there in order. It's not mashma. Mashma is that Rashi is coming to tell that he brought them together is lachnisim bebris. We'll see later on, as the Rebbe will explain in his explanation, that actually Rashi is coming to tell you that the whole gathering that took place before was for the purpose of lachnisim bebris, and that answers a lot of issues. So the Rashi is actually telling us that he gathered them. It didn't start with the atem nitzavim; it started with the vayakil that we read before in the end of Parshas Kisov, as we'll see later on. Base. After Rashi explains the psukim, he's going to raise you to be for him to a people. He's going to be your God. He's a mefarish in unser posuk noch zwei perushim. He explains in our verse two additional two interpretations. First, he says, why was the portion of Nitzavim placed close to the curses which we read in the Parshas Kisavim? Because they heard 100 curses, so they were very upset. They were worried. So Moshe started to appease them. You're standing today, and you are standing before him. Then he has to explain, the Rashi also explains there what it means today. According to this interpretation, that you're standing strong, it's like this day which is strong. And then Rashi continues, yet the third interpretation, since the Yidden were coming out from one leader to another leader, therefore, he had to make them. He made them into a standing amatzeva, kidei lezarzom, in order to encourage them. Stop and versteh. Aleph, was is schwer in the ersten Pirush? What is the difficulty in the first commentary? Was zu lieb dem darf Rashi ankommen zur zweiten Pirush, and that is why Rashi needs to come on to a second interpretation. Und dazu noch vom Medrash Agode. It's not a simple pshat. It brings you from Agoda. That means that there's something difficulty here, that he doesn't have a pshat interpretation. So it means that he needs to come out. So what's the difficulty? Especially Rashi emphasizes himself with regards to the first pirush. Says up till here, I explained according to the literal meaning of the parsha. And the second commentary says Umedrash Agoda specifically, That's a pshat, and starting the second parish, the Medrash Agoda. Then we have another issue. Is not maspik. The second commentary's interpretation is also not sufficient. And then Rashi has to come on to a third interpretation. That you're going from one leader, partners to partners, so it makes them a mitzvah. So even though we find that there must be a difficulty in the first shot, and in the second shot, it needs a third one. So we also know, as we had spoken many times, is the Erste Pirush B'Rashi B'chol Mokim Deriker. The first commentary of Rashi in all places, that's the main. The Zweiter Pirush is Nanter Zupshuter Shel Mikra V'de Dritte Pirush. The second interpretation is closer to the simple meaning of the verse more than the third one. So how we need to understand mit was is the dritte Pirush weiter from Shuter Shel Mikra with the zweite Pirush. Why is what is it that is in the third interpretation, commentary, interpretation that is more further away from the simple meaning, even more than the second Pirush, what is it? Based. Then this unusual fact that Rashi brings this commentary is not right in the pasuk over here. He waits till he finishes. So that means base. Von dem was Rashi bringt den Pirush von Medrash Agoda und nicht dem dritten Pirush, da war erst beim Pasuk Leman Hoki bei Yisrael Goymer over there. Und nicht gleich was Cholos HaParsha beim ersten Pasuk. Rashi does not bring it down in the beginning of the Parsha by the first verse, which it says Atem Nitzavim Hayem. Is muchach, it's evident as the zwei andere Pirushim Rashi that these two other commentaries in Rashi seinen Bescheiches nicht nur zu die Wörter Atem Nitzavim Hayom, that they don't only explain Atem Nitzavim Hayom, but auch zu the alle Psukim bis dem Poskim Anokim. So that they change everything. So Rashi waits, therefore, and brings the other one which changed them. When we losh on Rashi in the pasuk, at kan pirashim b'shutus parsha, up till here, meaning this is one pirush pshutus mikra, a parsha, the pshutus parsha, and umedesh agoda those haste, which means as the medesh agoda is another pirush, that the medesh agoda is a different interpretation. Oich in the andere psukim bizaher, also in the other verses up till now. And Ba'afo Pikein, so even though there are changes, seems like that interpretation, Taish Rashi nitois biprotius, them pirush in the alle psukim loid them medrash agoda dovracha. Rashi does not in detail give the interpretation of all these psukim, how it's going to be understood according to the medrash agoda, and how it's going to be understood dovracha. Is it moving? So it's not understood. Bald as the pirush and the aleph psukim baitzuk. Since the interpretation of the verses changes, as vos is Rashi mefarish loiten mogen loiten medrash agoda. How come Rashi explains on medrash agoda? Nor dem vort hayoim. How come he's only explaining hayoim? Rashi explains just one word according one pasuk. The atem Nitzavim hayoim. That hayoim means kayoim azeh kaim chulu. Like the day that you're standing, but not any of the other psukim, even though they all changed. Gimel. So now the Rebbe is going to explain that actually what we're talking about here is a reference to the previous Vayakil. It's not something which happened right here. Gimel. The Bir Bazeh. From them was Rashi Zogdem Losh. The fact that Rashi used a lot of language. So he doesn't use the Lashon Laviram, as the Rebbe said before. Does not use the language of the verse, which says to pass them through in the covenant. Is move on as a kum nish mefarer zayin divrei Moshe. So it's understood that he's not coming here to explain the words of Moshe. If he used the word lavrucha b'vris, he was telling you something about lavrucha b'vris. But he says lachnisa b'vris. Rashi is not coming to tell us that, and the reason is very poshut. Valdos is meforish and posuk. Posuk says that he brings him to the covenant. Rashi is coming to tell you something different. Now, Rashi is mechadish, abazunder in Inyan. Rashi comes up with a novelty, something separate, a separate aspect. But we'll let him talk from the Verta, which we learn. Atem Nitzavim Hayoim, you're standing today. One reason Atem Nitzavim Hayoim that comes up as a follower of Parshas Kumdi Parsha, this portion, Atem Nitzavim Hayoim Kulchem. So we're saying all of you are standing. So we're talking to them that they're standing there. It comes when we're saying you all are standing, in a following, it follows the end of the previous parsha. The previous parsha, Shvi says, "Vayikra Moshe kol Yisrael, Vayomer Aleim Moshe calls all Yidden, and he tells them Atam Nisim Yurusim." So this is a follow Atam Nitzavim Hayom Kulchem. You understand? Or a Maipsivol given a besondere Kriya. If this Atam Nitzavim was a separate calling, when a besondere Kinus and a separate gathering, or Damot Bereish Parsha say Nochmal gedacht stehen. So then at the beginning of our Parsha, should have said again, Vayikra Moshe kol Yisrael, Moshe calls to all Yidden. So Pashtus, this follows. Pashtus Dafman learning. So simply, we should learn. We need to learn. As the Vayikra Moshe kol Yisrael, when Moshe calls to all Israel, the kinus von alle Eden say Parshas Tovei, the gathering of all Jews in the end of the portion of Tovei, is given bitten Zweck that was for the purpose to sagen sie, those were stated like of them in Parsha. He told them what this says following that Parsha. So that's what he gathered them to tell them that. He says to them, is the pasuk over there. The great tests, and the great wonders, everything that Hashem done, and you should keep the words of His covenant, and do that. If you look at the pasuk, over there it says, the whole everything. It seems like that was the purpose they gathered to tell them. This is just a continuation of that main purpose of the gathering to tell them what he told them. In the end of Parshas Kisavei, Kumt Atem Nitzavim Hayom, this new point. So when them is Rashi Mechadish. So here Rashi comes up and says no, that this was actually the main purpose was the Atem Nitzavim. Melamed, from the words Atem Nitzavim, from the Verter Atem Nitzavim Hayom, from the words Atem Nitzavim Hayom, lernt man up. We learn Shekin Moshe Lifnei Hakodesh Baruch Hu Chulu Lachnisim Bebris, that Moshe gathered them before Hakodesh Baruch Hu. That Vayikra that he gathered them before was Lachnisim Bebris. Matoras Hakinus is need given to the Bibir Zay Zainer Reid was not to give him over his words and say Parshas Tovei nor Kin Moshe Lifnei Hakodesh Baruch Hu Chulu, but rather Moshe gathered them for Hashem Lachnisim Bebris, to enter them into the covenant. The hechrech of them is. So how do we know that the purpose that l'chatchila Moshe Rabbeinu? How does Rashi know Melamed that the purpose that Moshe Rabbeinu gathered them was for the Atem Nitzavim? So as the Rebbe said, the Erdem is Aleph. Number one, the Verter Atem Nitzavim, the words Atem Nitzavim, why are we all of a sudden saying over here Atem Nitzavim when they were already gathered? They seem to be not in the place. V'bal der steht schon früher, Vayikra Moshe El Kol Yisrael. That Moshe called to all of Yisrael. Seine doch alle Eden gewähnt bei Yisrael Maimed, so all the Eden were at that standing. Hat Moshe gedarf damit anheben. So Moshe should have started. Vayikra Moshe El Kol Yisrael, saying Atem Nitzavim. Oib me'eze tam. But if you're going to say that because for some reason, kidei madgi zayin lifnei Hashem elekeichem ukiyetzabay, he wants to say atem nitzavim hayom, not just you're standing, but lifnei Hashem elekeichem. Willer dos zogen davke, hat aber gedarf stehen ve'atem nitzavim. So if he wants to emphasize it, besides over there, he's just gathered them all together. He wants to tell them that they're standing lifnei Hashem elekeichem. So he should have said ve'atem nitzavim mit above ha'meisif, with above that adds if atem re'isim goyim v'tavay. You've seen what I've done to Egypt. Everything that is written in the end of Kisaveh, and then v'tavay muzmen zogen. We have to say as the loshon is epis malamed, that this language of atem nitzavim is trying to teach you something. Then the other thing is based that hemshech atem nitzavim hayem kulcham lifnei Hashem elekeichem. Why are we saying they're standing lifnei Hashem elekeichem? L'chayre zayin ze gven nitzavim lifnei Moshe. Moshe gathered. What do you mean lifnei Hashem elekeichem? Eif zu heaven was gitze iber, to hear what he's giving over to them. And here we say lifnei Hashem elekeichem. And Gimel hayom. So it says atem nitzavim, the general, and the financial, and also hayom. What means hayom today? Was meant b'yom Moshe. Hayom means today. Today means on the day that Moshe Rabbeinu was passing. How do we know that? That it's going on that last day of Moshe Rabbeinu. Vorum in Soif Parshas Tovei Zokter. In the end of Parshas Tovei, he says in Shvi. He says, Hashem has not given you the heart to know until this day. When Rashi is talking to Farish, and Rashi explains over there, that at the time that Moshe gave the Sefer Torah to Bnei Levi, that is when he told them that. As it says in the Parshas Vayelach, that Moshe Rabbeinu gave the Sefer Torah. Later on, we learn the Parshas Vayelach. When was that? Was Dosis given the day that he passed? Parshas Vayelach kum behemshach bizman echot to Parshas Nitzavim. So this is all coming, and the portion of Vayelach comes in a follow-up, a continuation from the same time to Parshas Nitzavim. So we have the pasuk leinosan lochem leiv lodas, which is when the God of Sefer Torah, as Rashi explains, Sefer Torah was given by Yom Moshe. It says so this is one flow. But oy mizolenen as the kinus is given b'chdei zu zogen zei. But if the purpose of the gathering was to tell them, temrisim es kol asher also goymer, you've seen what Hashem has done. Amasa gedolos goymer shmartem goymer. And you saw all the great trials and the great things that took place, and therefore Shmartim you should keep, which is a chizuk in Shmiras HaTorah Mitzvahs. This is a encouragement, a strengthening for Torah Mitzvahs in general. If this was the purpose of their gathering, why did Moshe Rabbeinu wait until the last day, the day that he was passing? He didn't say this earlier. Mishnah Torah doch Moshe Rabbeinu angeben sagen. He started to say Mishnah Torah. On the 11th month, the month of Shvat, Rosh Chodesh Shvat. So why does he wait till Zion Oder to tell them this chizuk? So those alts is machriach. So all this forces us to conclude as matoras akinu to say parshas tovei that the goal and the purpose of the gathering of the end of tovei, vayikra Moshe call Yisrael, Moshe calls to all of Israel, is given lachnisim bebrisa beparshas seinu, was in order to bring them into the covenant, which we read in our parsha. And here we know why the Masder Bris is given again. This covenant is mainly important after they pass the Yardin. Virashi zogt weiter be Parsha Seinu. As Rashi says later on in the Parsha, that this was that covenant that made them responsible for one another in the bris. So he therefore delayed it until the day of his passing, because that's when it wasn't needed. He needed it for after his passing, so he waited until the day of his passing. As close as possible to the time when the Yidden passed through the Yard. Okay. So basically, the Rebbe explains here that Rashi's Chiddush is here to teach us what the original gathering that we read in the Shvi, the Parshas Tovei, that this was in order for Atem Nitzavim. This was the purpose where they gathered, and that way we understand why we're using the language of Atem Nitzavim to, and also. And why he waited for this time. So, Dalet. So it turns out that mainly it was Atem Nitzavim, the purpose of the gathering. And the previous words were just like sort of an introduction. Dalet. That based on the above, the Atem Nitzavim kun behemshach to the Friedike Kriya from Moshe, that this comes as a follow-up to the previous calling of Moshe, call Yisrael. This is a follow-up. Uli idoch is matoras hakinus. So Moshe called all Yisrael, but the purpose of the gathering is given l'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu lachnisim bebris. He wants to bring them for Hashem, to bring them to the covenant. When they say Parshas Tovei, and this that we read in the end of Parshas Tovei, the whole discussion of there is Zayin al Derech L'Mayim Amuzgar, there's sort of as a parenthesis. He's just introduction before the purpose of the gathering is there. It's only an introduction and a preparation for this. This gives us an understanding, two more details. Two details in the simple meaning of the pasuk that Rashi does not make a note of, but they seem to be problems, and now we understand it because the question becomes, why did Moshe Rabbeinu call Yisrael? He called also the Tapchem. Why would he need the Tapchem over there? If the purpose was for Atem Nitzavim and Lavrucha Bebris, then we understand. But just to Chizuk Torah Mitzvahs, why would he have the Tap over there? Aleph, the Torah, the Mondo Tapchem. By us, it says also the little children. In the Torah, gefindt man nicht, as Moshe Rabbeinu soll rufen, euch Taf. We don't find that Moshe Rabbeinu should also be calling the little children. Beim Zusammenkleiden Eden, when he gathered the Eden. For every purpose that it may be. We don't find the Torah to single out that he also brought the little children. Nochmer, more than this. If we do find, like later on, where there's children, Rashi comments, weiter in Parshas Vayelach, where steht Hakelas Ha'om Anoshim V'Anoshim V'Hatav. Taka mentions their Tav. Stellt sich Rashi with them. So Rashi places himself and he cautions. Lama Bo, why did the Tav come? He says, Los Yischar L'Miviyeh, to give reward to those who bring them. So you see that other than that, there is really no taf of them. Unsis move on as loit Rashi, that it's understood that according to Rashi, is b'parsha seinu need dos their tam. In our parsha, that wouldn't be the reason that tapchem were there to bring the schar, because why doesn't Rashi say it over here? But them was voltas Rashi b'farish given by Mershnemol. Then Rashi would have commented over here, right over here, and told us why the taf is over here. He would not rely, in our case, the tafchem. Why does he bring tafchem on this that he's going to bring on a later on the sedra? So it means over here there's a different reason. The parsha seinu of the tav gedav zayin. So although in the subject matter in our parsha the children needed to be the tav, so they too should be included. They should be taken in the covenant of the forming of the covenant. But this was for everybody. So they needed to be there. But but this is still, we don't find another gathering. So this is part of the gathering of Parshas Tovai. As the Tav that they were there from the beginning of this gathering. When Moshe was saying, you've seen the great trials, you shall keep this covenant and do them. The Tav were also there. You don't find that this was not a new Atam Nitzavim, a new gathering here. Was to them, they wasn't applicable to them. They not mitzvahs. So why would the Tav be there from the beginning? But now that we're saying that to begin with, this was for the Atam Nitzavim, so we understand. So that's not for the mitzvahs. The other mitzvahs, not chizuk mitzvahs for the Tav, but the Tav needed to be for the Krisus Bris. But based on the above in Rashi's explanation, that Moshe is given that what Moshe was living in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the reason why Moshe called them was to be before Hashem, to bring them into the covenant. That was the purpose of the gathering. Is move. Then it's understood was gleich betchilas pascholos hakriya. As soon as they called them, Moshe Rabbeinu called them together. But my gebracht tav, you brought the little children. Varum matoras hakinus is given lachnisa bebris, because the purpose, the goal of the gathering was to bring them into the covenant. Und die Rede atem nisim gomer zan bloß akdome dazu. And the words Atam Nisim are only introduction. So that's one thing that gives us an explanation why were the Tav there during the gathering from the beginning. And the answer is the beginning wasn't really the goal. The goal was the second part. And number two, it wouldn't fit to start Atam Nitzavim without having an introduction first. So therefore, this way, that introduction is for the Atam Nitzavim, based. Is before placing on someone a certain obligation, especially when you're talking about placing a shvua for them, you have to come some explanation, some introduction. You don't come to somebody with obligation, swear. Don't. So this Atam Nitzavim was to bring you through into the covenant of God your God and in His Allah, in His Shvuah, in His oath. So it was a covenant and an oath of every Yid, from verschiedene Sugim from Klal Yisrael, from the verschiedenste, from the most different categories of Klal Yisrael. Wie kommt es? As Moshe hat sich früher nicht gesagt, etwas Akdome, that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't tell them some introduction to Azad Dover Godel V'chomer, to such a great and serious matter. Was this Shailas B'toikev, this would be a strong question, Sai, whether we would learn, Oy Vayikra Moshe Kol Yisrael is given, to lieb sagen sie Atem Reisim Goymer. It was to tell them Atem Reisim Goymer B'meil is given, Der La'avrecha B'bris Hashem Elokecha B'olosei. And therefore Hashem is bringing you through. Upshita. So even if that was the Vayikra Moshe was for telling them the Atem Reisim, and therefore the Avruch of Rishem, but still, Upshita Oiv Zolena as Atem Nitzavim Shebar Senu is going to kill it from Yatzmei, especially if we should learn that this was a gathering by itself. How do you start off by putting them through a Shavua? But according to Rashi's explanation, Askin Samosh living HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Lachnisim Bevris, that the reason he gathered them was to bring him into the covenant. Thus is given the Matorah. That was the goal. Is that in your movement? Then this is understood. But because this that you saw Masgil is talking given the Hasbore and the Reinfir. That was the explanation, and that led into the Matorah to the goal of to bring you through in the Bris Hashem. So this was actually the introduction. So this explains, now the Rebbe adds the two aspects that were difficult in the Sukkim. Without, now that we know why is the Taf there, and how do you start it off just by bringing them to a Shvuah and a Olah without an introduction. But now we're saying this was all for the purpose of the Taf were there because it was for the Avruch Hashem. And this is the introduction. It's not all of a sudden. This is all an introduction to Atem Nitzavim. Okay. So this is the Pshuta Shel Mikra Pshat. And now the Rebbe is going to explain what is the problem with this interpretation that Rashi needs to bring another Pirush from the Medrash Agoda. And the Rebbe explains that the words Nitzavim is Rashi's difficulty with the first shot. Should have said Oimdim. The Nitzavim means the strong standing doesn't really fit here, that language. And that's what Rashi says, the Medrash Agoda, that Nitzavim is Davke because of the clothes which were next to here, as Rashi explained the Medrash Agoda. Hey, Leidam Pirush is Obeniter Klert. According to this interpretation, it's not explained that the language used here, which is not so common, Nitzavim. Why is it Nitzavim? The Fia now allows their Loshen. Loshen said, based on the above, that this language is telling us, as Kinsa Moshe Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chulach Nisim Bevris, that Moshe gathered them before Hashem to bring them into the covenant. But what state Nitzavim? Why does it say Nitzavim, not, which is an unusual language? We need the Loshen Eimdim, not Loshen standing. Atam Eimdim. What's his rogel in Torah, which is more common in the Torah? Weiter in Parsha is also in our Parsha, it says, Imonu Eimed Hayoim. Yeshne Poim. Veshanenu Eimed Imonu Hayoim. So it means he uses Loshen of Eimed. So why does it say not Atem Eimdim Hayoim? Nochmer, nor is das nit kein Loshen Arogil. Not only is it not the common language, nor as Pastelcher and Nidoin, Posuk Mitzadam Teichen, it seemingly doesn't fit here because of the content. Nitzavim is al derech v'Rashi taich. Nitzavim, as Rashi explained, they're standing with a raised up, standing up, upright. like it says by the Koirach, they went the Das Lavirim Nitzavim. That's a became a skufa. Mashenk the Lashon Emdim can show on the level of subjugation. Since he gathered them before Shem Lachnisim Bebris to bring him into the covenant, is doch verstandig as is an gestanden mit no ubittel. It's understood that they were standing there subdued and subjugated. If he zokter nitzavim was weiß der Starkheit und Größkeit. So how come he says nitzavim, which points to strength and greatness? That's why Rashi brings a second commentary. Umedrash Hagoda, the Medrash Hagoda, dos kum behemshach to the klolos. This is a follow-up to the curses. When his chil Moshe lefaison, atem nitzavim hayim. That Moshe started to appease them that you are standing to them. If Azoy feel that they're so standing strongly to such an extent, as choch, although that you have made a lot. You got Hashem angry a lot. And he has not made you, not destroyed you. And you're standing before him. That Goshe b'miyuchad is in the word Nitzavim. The emphasis is specifically in the word Nitzavim. That points to a strong standing. And according to this Pirush, we're not only changing the intent and the translated word Nitzavim, but also what it means, the word Hayoim. As those and divrei piyus of the klolos, it changes the word Hayoim over here, because since this is words of appeasement for the curses, so we have to say in Pashtus, Ados is given bismichas bisman, that this was close in time to the teichacha, to the time of the rebuke. Ubemeile is mistaber Ados is given b'yem meisei. So then it doesn't really logically fit to say that this was when he, on the day of his passing, like we learned before, that the Atem Nitzavim, L'Avrucha Bebris, was on the last day, before he passed, on the day of his passing. Because if this is talking about appeasing the klolos, Aleph, the kavanah for the teichacha, the intent of the rebuke is that was in order to encourage them for the observance of Torah mitzvahs. So for sure he wouldn't wait till the day of his passing. He would have said it before. Beis, and number two says nistaber as it doesn't fit, doesn't sit right to say that on the day of his passing he was different than klolos. On the day of his passing, close to his death, he actually blessed them, as it says in the beginning of Bracha, that Moshe Rabbeinu blessed them at the time before his passing. So the Rebbe must Rashi oich lernen. That's why Rashi has to learn. As the word Hayom hot another types, the word Hayom means something different. Was kum behemshech zu dem pirush von Atem Nitzavim. That follows the interpretation of Atem Nitzavim, that we're saying that you're standing strong because the klolos that Hayom means something else. The Baal Atem Nitzavim means, since Atem Nitzavim means Hare Atem Kayom Lefonim Chula, you're still standing before him. And the curses and the pains stand you up, and they make you strong before Hashem. Is the Taich from Hayom. So also the Taich from Hayom is not a day, but Kayim Azeshu Kayim. It's like the day that you're standing. The Baal does the Divrei Piyus Musan Zayin B'Smichas to the Teichachem. Since the words of appeasement need to be close to the time of rebuke, is Rashi Moisif So Rashi adds, as the psukim hayoser smuchim to them, that the psukim which are closest to the closer, the parsha maila mizu piyusim matam risim are also piyusim. So that starts already the piyusim right in Shvi, following the toichacha, which is a shishi, and then that's also piyusim. And now we're going to explain, okay, so why do we need the next pirush? What's wrong with this? Vav, aber euch der pirush is schwer. But this is difficult, this interpretation. But Aleph, number one, if he's out gedarf stehen frier, atem nitzavim. So first, it should have said atem nitzavim, which would be the strength that you're standing strong. Und dann noch the parsha atem risim gomer. Was is that that is the translation and the articulation of the main appeasement, which is atem nitzavim, and then that lo also is chamkloyo varatem kliyam lefonim chulu, that you're standing va'klolu va'yisur mekayim matzivin eschem, and the close yisurim they station you and they make you standing strong atem nitzavim, and then tell them the atem reisim, which is also piyus, as Rashi brings down. And base, so that's one problem with the second shot. Base, if the parsha divre piyus u'moshe, if this is a piyus u'moshe, v'kumen dort tapchem. What do the little children belong there? For they verstehen the teichacha, they don't understand the teichacha. U'b'meila daven they need the divre piyus, so we don't need for them the words of appeasement. The Rebbe brings Rashi at written pirush. Therefore, Rashi brings a third commentary that lefi shehoyu Yisrael yotzim meparnes leparnes. But the Yidden were coming out from one leader to the other leader. The Moshe li Yeshua from Moshe Yeshua. Lefikach also is a matzeva k'dei lezarzim chulu. He made them into a matzeva, into a monument, into a standing, right, in order to encourage them. Was al pizei is verstanding the loshen mitzavim. We understand the language of Nitzavim, not Oimdim, Matzeva. From the Lashon weist auf Zirus, because the word Nitzavim also shows of encouragement, Zirus. When the Pirush there is Aleph that Taich Hayem b'Yom Meisu Diloit Neshem Pirush. Hayem means on the day of his passing, just like according to the first shot. Kibuvim b'Pashtus. This is connected, leaving one leader to the other, so that's on the day of his passing. That first he says, you say before, that that's why we have to say it as close to his passing, when Panas Lepanas, from one leader to the other one, so that he left for last. And Gimel, move him to bring in the Taf, we also understand why you bring the little children, or so they also go from one leader to the other leader. So this would answer the problems that we had on the second interpretation, that Atem Nitzavim belongs over here, and the top need to be there, and the meaning of Hayoim goes back to the way we learned originally, because that's the day of his passing. So now we got to go explaining the difficulties in the third shot. Zion, the Schwerigkeit in the Pirush is. So what's the difficulty in this interpretation? Since this is tied to the time that they're leaving from one leader to the other leader, so the Moshe should have said this at the very last. Noch Parshas Vayelech, after the portion of Vayelech. Should have been said close to his actual passing. How come it says earlier? So the Rebbe explains, according to the first shot, that he gathered them on the day of his passing to bring them into the covenant. Since this was important for after the time they went over the Yarden, is it mochrach as soll sein somuch l'misosei mamish? It doesn't have to be mamish close to his passing. Hayeshes can saibe sainit zayin somuch l'nyoni. Cannot anyways be close because the Yarden is going to take place later. So it can't be there, so you can place it a little bit before. But according to the third comment as interpretation, Ados is verbunden, that this is connected with the Yitzia, miparnes leparnes, from going out from one leader to the other. What does gedarft sein? Somuch la Yitzia mamish. They should have been close to the time that they actually left. So why is it doing before Parshas V'elach? So the Afal Piyas that say to Pirush is Medrash Agoda, even though the second interpretation is an Agodic interpretation, is as nenter zum Pshuta shel Mikra with the Dritter Pirush. It's still closer to the simple meaning of the verse than the third one. But Leuten Dritten Pirush is Atem Nitzavim, according to the third Pirush, Atem Nitzavim, an Inyan b'fnei atzmei. It's an independent subject. Has no connection to what Moshe called to the end of Tova. So it's like a totally separate inyan, telling them beparnes leparnes. As opposed to the second pirush, is nit nor atem nitzavim. Not only does it follow the Moshe's words that you've seen at the end of Tova, but that was the purpose and the goal of the Faisam, to appease them. Was the Rikerapius is in Atem Nitzavim Canal. The main thing is to tell them that they're standing. So this is actually a clear follow-up. So that's why the second one is much closer to than the third one, than the third Pirush, because the third one just has no hamshach to the Beikra Moshe. Over here it has a follow-up. This was actually the whole purpose. The main Piyus is Atem Nitzavim. They're all divrei Piyus, as Rashi says in the second Pirush, that Parshas Tova divrei Piyus too. Und in them is das Nentur Medoimet zum ersten Pirush, and in this way it's more closer and similar to the first interpretation, as the Matorah from Kinsa Moshe is Mavur b'Parshasenu, that the goal that Moshe gathered them is explained in our Parsha Lachnisum Bebris, to bring them into the covenant. Ches. For Yeno Shel Torah in the Pirush Rashi. The wine of Torah, this Pirush Rashi. Parshas Nitzavim Leintman Alamo Koidem Rosh Hashanah. The portion of Nitzavim we always read for Rosh Hashanah. Und das ist rumors in the word Hayoim, was geht of Rosh Hashanah. That's hinted in the word Hayoim, which goes on Rosh Hashanah. And then is Rashi Mefarish, and Rashi explains, Malamed, Shekim Som Moshe Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Yemei Lachnisem B'Bris, that Moshe Rabbeinu gathered them before Hashem on the day of his passing to bring them to the bris. Chotz as frier in Parshas, in Soy Parshas Tova Shteitzoi. Although in the end of Parshas Tova already it states, what Moshe told the Yidden, Atem re'isa mamasas ha'kedolos gemer, u'shmartem es divrei habris v'zois v'asisa Moshe, what you've seen, all the great things that Hashem has done, and you should keep, therefore, the words of the covenant and do them. Ki matorah mitzvahs is ober the matoras hakinus b'yom Moshe. The goal of the kinus is b'yom Moshe. Ayom hadin, it is b'yom hadin lachnitzim b'bris, to bring to the covenant. Was a Christus bris is hecher von avona v'asogya. Making a covenant, lachnitzim b'bris, to bring them into a covenant on the Yom Adin, which is Hechef Avonos, which is beyond, higher than grasping. You form a covenant. On Rosh Hashanah, it's accomplished this essence of a connection from a Yid with Hashem. Was his kashrus, that connection is kinsom lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You gather them before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A yichud v'hiskalus with Eibishter Alein. This is a union and an inclusion with Hashem alone. Hecher afilu for Torah mitzvahs, which is even higher than Torah mitzvahs. That's the yichud. Afal became kagdom lozeh as an introduction. Before kinsom v'Hakadosh, that lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is given the dibur was bringen zu schmartem es dibur abiris azois vasis. There was the speech, the saying that Moshe Rabbeinu told them to keep the words of this covenant, to do them. Because this connection of the essence was Yisroel v'kuchabrichu kulu chad, that Yidden and Hashem are really one. Kum begilu al yidei Torah. This comes through Torah, but Torah is the mamutza hamachaber Yidden mit Eibishter. Torah is the intermediary that ties the Yidden with Hashem. With the loshem is brengt sich kam upon him, and as the language that is used, that's brought down many times of the Zohar, this loshem Zohar, tlas kishrin. So there are three knots miskashron do bedo, one with the other. It's Yisrael miskashron be'eraisa, that the Yidden tied to the Torah, be'eraisa v'kuchabricha, and the Torah to Hashem. That would only make two knots. If you have three things that tie, there's only two knots. However, what happens here is that after the Yidden become connected, tied to Hashem through Torah, also from themselves, they're also connected. First through Torah, but then there's another knot which the Yidden connect directly to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's a connection which is higher than that tying that takes place through Torah. So then you have, that's why three knots. Yisrael, Oraisa, Kuchabrichu Yisrael. Yisrael to the Torah to Kuchabrichu, and then Kuchabrichu to Yisrael. Kedugma Se'igel, which becomes a circle, closer. The Meila Muzayin de Agdome for Shmartem Goimer. There has to be the introduction for Shmartem, as we learn in Pashik Sove. Aber Matorah v'tachas hakinus, b'yom Rosh Hashanah, but on Rosh Hashanah is this kashrus atzmis von Yid mit Eibishter. That's the essence connection of a Yid with Hashem. Das ist aber nicht genug. This is, however, not sufficient. The bris, that atzmidike verbund avkum begilui, that essence connection needs to come out revealed. Und beruchnis, und euch begashmis, and both spiritually and physically, haben hashpos de gashmi, to have the flow of physical good from the Eibishter from Hashem b'toiv ha'nira b'nigla, in good that is visible and revealed. Punkt wie der Eibishter will von Yidden, just as Hashem wants from the Jews, as Ozayin Kim HaMitzvus, Lekach Kim HaTorah. It should be the fulfillment of Torah, Lekach Toiv VaMitzvus. This, the good receive the Torah and the mitzvahs, Maisa B'Poel, Maisa Oiker. Maisa is the main. So the Eibishter expects from us that we should actually do the mitzvahs. So the Yidden ask and receive from Hashem the Allah Hashpois, all the flows. Was a kuma rope gashmis, and they come to sound physically. The good which is visible, seen and revealed. The Maisa the Poil and action. Then come der zweite Pirush. So then we come to the second Pirush. As Hischel Moshe lePaisa. Moshe started to appease them. Moshe, the Mamutza Mechaber from Eibishter mit Yidden. He is the intermediary that connects Hashem with the Yidden. Poiled, he impacts us. Kayomim, the fun of we stand before him with oifim from Nitzavim, and we have Nitzavim b'koyim skufa, b'gashmis, physically. Noch mer, b'klolot v'yisurim mekaymes ch'matzimes ch'mufon of. The curses and the Yisurim stand you up and make you stand strong before Hashem. The nigevunchen zachem from them over, the non-wishful things that took place in the past, that nepach to brochis, they turn into blessings, begilui, openly, betoiv anirim anigla, the good that is visible, seen and visible and revealed, and that is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Nitzavim Tavshin Chav Hey.